Okay, let's go ahead and get started here. Let me get things ready to go. Thanks everyone for joining us today. We'll be having a nice session with Jim Bannister, CPO of Raisin, on his capacity planning technique. And just by way of quick agenda for today, I'll be introducing sort of the methodology and research behind how we even met Jim in the first place, and the things that we've learned, Grant and I, from our research. And then we'll be going through that capacity planning workshop where Jim will be sharing his technique and methodologies and a sanitized workbook on how he kind of thinks about supply and demand of his organization. And then we'll leave a couple of minutes at the very end for Q&A. And so if you have any questions along the way, feel free to just type them into the Zoom chat or send them directly to Grant Monroe. So by the way, all slides and the recordings will be sent to all the attendees. So you don't necessarily have to take too many notes. So quick introduction. So if you don't know me and Grant, we are Toronto based, and we met in 2014 when Grant had initially founded his first company called Flashstock. We spent 3 years growing that business, and we sold it to Shutterstock. And ever since then, we've been kind of building product and really focusing on product. We left Shutterstock around the same time earlier this year, and we were chatting about product and especially the challenges that we faced both at a small organization before the acquisition, then obviously during the acquisition and post-acquisition as well. And so with those sort of challenges, we thought, hey, maybe other people in the field within product management also face these types of issues. And so our initial goal was to speak with 50 heads of product. We reached out to Jim, and he was so gracious enough to speak with us, and we learned a ton from him. But we also ended up exceeding that goal and ended up being able to speak with more than 88 participants from US and Canada and Europe. So overall, 72 heads of product, and we also were able to speak with 16 heads of sales and CS to get their perspectives as well on the challenges that their product organizations face. Just for context, 90% of the companies that we spoke to were B2B software sales, SaaS, sorry, between 51 and 500 employees. And sort of from a framework perspective, we ran qualitative interviews, learning priorities, the workflows, the challenges, and the implications of those challenges. The output of that was a report that we had initially put together, and then we turned into a roundtable discussing those themes a couple of weeks back. So if you're interested, feel free to click on those links later on. And just to kind of cue that up, so we've got an upcoming research project around what tools, methodologies that people are using in their current product organizations. So if you're interested in participating in that, we'd love to have you and speak with you directly and one-on-one. So just before I introduce Jim, some of the themes from the report and what we've heard are, well, broken down into three major components. The first one being the knowledge gap between different teams, sales teams, marketing teams, developers, they all have a differing perspective on what problems need to be solved and how they might implement a solution. So how do you sort of create that 360 view? One of my favorite anecdotes was there was a really big frustration between people setting the strategy and people executing the story, can't see each other's context. The second theme over here is curating the why for non-product teams. So favorite anecdote here was sales and CS teams are super hungry and ravenous for how the roadmap ties into customer stories. That whole customer piece is missing. So being able to showcase how a product team comes up with their decisions in the first place to the rest of the company, super important. And then lastly, which we got a ton of interest on, and hence why we're doing this follow-up workshop, is showing the supply and the demand of the product organization. And so favorite anecdote was the lack of alignment sort of manifests at the board or founder level in an inefficient organization. If they can't feel it, they can't see it, they sort of default to saying it's inefficient. And so Jim's got a cool way of showing how you can really articulate that to the rest of the company and sort of avoid those types of defaulting to inefficiencies. So without further ado, it's Jim's time. He's a chief product officer at Raisin, and which is a savings and investment marketplace that connects retail customers to the banks. And I'll leave it to you now, Jim.
Cool. So I won't introduce myself. You can go read my LinkedIn profile. I won't waste the time. I'll go through this pretty quickly. Jeremy, can you let me share screen? Or?
Yep.
Excellent. And I'm going to pause at a couple points here so that you can ask questions in different sections, but I'm going to go through it pretty quick because everybody has a lot of context already for doing product work. The problem that I was setting out to solve was improving the efficacy of a group of cross-functional product teams, especially those that aren't really used to working together, or like a group, teams that have formed recently, or a group of teams that have expanded from 2 or 3 to 13 or 15 or 20 very, very quickly. And some of the things I've experienced are going from building what we sell, product being a slave to the business, to selling what we build, product increasingly proactive and leading. I don't know what product is, but I know it's inefficient. I got that several times. People, frustrated that product is a relatively new function and they just don't know. It's a black box. Founders and business leaders have total transparency and influence and context would be the 2. Conversations on demand for supply of cross-functional talent happening ad hoc and in silos. And that means rampant oversubscription. That happens a lot. I don't know if that's familiar to some of you guys, but I've experienced this, I've experienced this a number of times. And what we try to get to is demand curated holistically, visible conversations and prioritization happening in unison. So I may not like the priorities, but I can totally see why the priorities are there. And that doesn't happen a lot because there's exponential frustration by, say, a business stakeholder when they can't see, they can see that their stuff's not being prioritized, but they can't see what other stuff is being prioritized and why. Unpredictable delivery to more predictable delivery, and locally optimized squeaky wheel prioritization to more organic balance of local and global optimization of priorities. So that's the sort of from to statements that I try and work on with this particular. Oh, I missed one. High level of dependency between missions, teams, and stacks, and more independency of the same. And the technique that I learned from others years and years ago, and have adapted for the personality of each of the companies that I've worked for over the last, say, 7 years, 8 years, is this thing called capacity planning. And this isn't a new concept, although applying it to agile teams, it takes a bit of nuance. And it's essentially better matching of supply and demand. Supply of cross-functional talent and demand from the different realms of the business. So let's get into that. We'll start with what I call squad realities. Raisin went from like 3 squads to now, I think it's 12 or 13. I haven't counted it actually recently. And each of these squads has an idiosyncratic, let's call it a histogram of capabilities and capacity, right? So they each have a different mission. And so they're comprised of a different group of back-end and front-end engineers with different skill levels and different subject matter expertise and so forth. So we try and break that down and get a better view of both the amount of, I'll call them business imperatives and incidents. It just so happened that you see this bulb right here. We had a few teams that are just slammed with, they have a rare set of skills and a unique mission, and they're slammed with incidents because we have a monolithic historical stack. And they're also part of a mission that's critical to our core business. And so everybody keeps saying, well, we want them to work in this green area, and they have a massive amount of red, and the business can't see it or couldn't see it. And so making sure we can map that clearly is a key input. And I'm just going to go through sort of what we do really quickly. So in unison, product owners and chapter leads and squad tech leads, and these are sort of classic definitions, and we actually embody those: the what, why, and when by the product owners, and the how by the tech leads, and in some cases the chapter leads. What we do is we curate all the sources of demand. It just so happens, this is ours. You guys will get a link to this, so I'm not going to read every bit of it. The first one is essentially overhead, and there's holiday reorganization work, sometimes talent moving, onboardings, et cetera. There's just the nature of overhead, meetings, big meetings from town halls and so forth. Then there's incidents, this we call major unplanned work, business imperatives, which are things that, the phrase I use is, if you guys are sailors below the waterline when you're out in the middle of the ocean, get a hole below the waterline, you know, it's urgent, you got to do it, it risks the business. And so that's the kind of business imperatives I mean here. And then I called this blue one out because there's often these big bets or major initiatives like replatforming, for example. That's something we're going through that are special and they're unique to different companies. And then there's engineering initiatives that are bubbling up, you know, for CI/CD, infra, and so forth. And then there's UX improvements. This is for us, we have 3 different customer segments: customer experience, partner experience, and Raisinair experience, which is the internal tooling. And, you know, there's a ... here. So it's just a matter of, we wanted to make sure we curated all of these things, and I'll show you a bit more about how we do that in a second. And what happens is we pull that into a macro backlog, right? Everybody has access to it, everybody can see it, and I'll show it to you in a second, the tool in a second. And then there's parallel preparations going on. That's OKRs, or however you do them. Then we do the curated candidate initiatives, and we curate the epics and stories that comprise those. Sometimes it spikes. And then we do epic estimations and dependencies. Typically we do swags. I'm sure everybody's familiar with those. And we use typically planning poker type swags, using the algorithms of our humans, not hardcore estimations. We will do estimations if we have time, and it's relatively straightforward. But typically the swags are good enough for this tool. And then there's this, what I'll call the price of admission to the capacity plan. It doesn't get considered full stop unless that all these things are ticked. There's a statement of context, there's job stories, definition of done, related OKR, this is actually treating. There's maybe a local KPI for the particular initiative or epic to tell us that we achieved what we wanted to achieve. And then of course, some estimation, whether it's a swag or a specific estimation. And then we have rules of engagement, which is we estimate where we can, swag where we can't, use consistent swag units. We happen to use person weeks. We can talk more about that in a second. And do not swag or estimate for other teams. Most of us know that's a big no-no. To do that, we go to the source of where we have that, where we require capacity or subject matter expertise and ask for those swags or those estimates. And there's one backlog. We do not allow shadow initiatives. There are no 2 backlogs. Oftentimes you'll see that when I came, there was a engineering backlog, there was a architecture backlog, and there was a sort of product backlog. That's gone away. There's a single backlog. So I'll come back to the actual capacity plan. What we end up with is this unprioritized list of initiatives and epics. And we aim for a workshop where we ratify the plan. And we do virtual or actual roundtables. We literally, it's like selling encyclopedias door to door. We go door to door to every single unit in the company. It's very efficient. Sometimes we open a Slack channel, often we do, and we have those conversations virtually, but we almost always do a face-to-face so we can mutually share context to help them understand what's going on in the product teams and the tech teams. And they can share their context as well, and we talk through what's important, why it's important, et cetera. We do the same thing with the engineering groups as well. And then we aim for a capacity planning workshop, which is less than 1 day. Over time, as you go cycle to cycle, you end up, it takes maybe 2 hours to do this. It gets very, very organic over time. And there is an agenda that we go through on that day very quickly. And these are the people that are invited to that day. Most of them are required. They need to be there. It's, you know, they can complain, but they can't complain after, you know, they've actually participated in the workshop and they can actually see everything. So, I'm going to very quickly show you before I show you sort of the rhythm, I'll show you the worksheet that we use. So this has gone through many iterations over the years. It's not precious about how well programmed and so forth, as long as it works and everybody's aligned to the same thing. What you see here across the top is the teams, essentially. You know, you can list the tribes they're in. We happen to have a few tribes, the product owner, and then the name of the team. And then what you'll see that there is input that the PO has to do, the number of team members here, and then they have to put in, this is essentially based on historical data, I beg your pardon, this one here. They have to actually go, not have to, get to, because this is an empowerment for them, talk through about what their overhead is, and it changes from squad to squad. These are actual numbers from our last capacity planning. And every single squad has a different context, right? The overhead, they may have new onboarding, they may have a lot of parental leave or holidays, happening, et cetera. And then the unplanned work, you can see that varies pretty greatly. So this team, that was the one I was talking about before, that big red bubble in terms of incidents and unplanned work. That's one of our core teams for our deposits business. And they just happen to have a lot of predictable unpredictability is the phrase I use. And so we have to make room for that because we don't know what it'll be. And then there's planning inefficiencies, which means that in this capacity planning, it doesn't speak to sequencing and what needs to come first, second, third. And so we actually budget an inefficiency in terms of the sequencing. And then we end up with and then over here, we actually put in the number of weeks in the cycle. The cycle doesn't have to be quarterly, could be 6 months, could be 6 weeks. We choose to do it right now at every 3 months. And then you'll see a raw capacity. And then we take out now you'll actually see a bunch of math in here. You don't need to do this. This is all the math that we use for both figuring out what the capacity actually is, number one, and number two, after the fact, once we've gone through the process, that we can actually see our portfolio investment. Where did the money go? And that feeds into our ROI. And then on the left side, you see all the initiatives. Well, those are hidden here. So we use the Jira Advanced Roadmaps now, and so the initiatives are here. We may have sub-initiatives because there may be multiple ones within an initiative, and then the epics that actually comprise those initiatives. They all map to OKRs, et cetera. And you'll see, this was last quarter, so there were, let's see how many there were. So this is everything across the business, across engineering that people had the ambition to do. So 245 or 245. And we go through every single one of those. Every team, you'll see here, every team has a responsibility for going through theirs, talking to their stakeholders, speaking to the individual business stakeholders, and scrubbing it. And you'll see that some of them are relatively independent. Like this is what's called our tooling squad, our internal tooling squad. They have a lot of independence. They have all of their initiatives had very little dependency on other squads. But then you'll scroll down and you'll see other ones that there's clusters where you can see lots of dependencies. And that means they have to have conversations PO to PO involving the stakeholders, et cetera. They don't take that long. They're just pointed. You need to go through this. You need to talk about them, look at the actual epic, talk through what the scope is. Are we talking about the same outcomes, et cetera, et cetera. So it forces those conversations. And what happens is, they'll actually start revising, refactoring. We typically go through 2 or 3 iterations about 3 weeks before we start at about 3 weeks before the end of the quarter. That's our planning cycle. And then what happens is these numbers up here go red, and they should go slightly red. And once they're red, no more demand. Or you start doing the horse trading and you're saying, well, that's not as important. And so those conversations are actually forced. And I'll tell you, I've used this for many years in different contexts in slightly different variations, and it works. It's just a model, and it works because you're actually harnessing the algorithms of all the humans on the pitch. And it's magical what comes out of it. And I'll give you an example. Last quarter, the company said we could do 113 different initiatives. That's what came out of the capacity planning. Turns out we couldn't do 113, but we did do fully completed 86% of all those 113 initiatives. And it was very, very clear why we didn't do certain ones or we partially completed other ones. And so that's what we report every quarter. And so the efficacy was quite high. So I'm going to jump back into and then I'm going to pause here. So what happens is that feeds it. So what you end up with this ratified, if you will, capacity planning workbook. And then you do a bit of horse trading, talk through the OKRs, do stack ranking if you need to, and make sure that we're talking about the squad realities. And you end up with this sort of rolling roadmap that in our case is quarterly right now. And our intention is by middle of next year, or maybe spring of next year, to be more on a 6-week cycle. And one sort of last point here is that program management, whether it's dedicated project and program managers, or it's us as product people sort of filling that role, what capacity planning is the planning, we use program management for execution. So we do weekly check-ins, we have a change log, and we have an actively managed impediments backlog to make sure that we're actually enabling the teams to build, measure, learn, so that this function is egoless and objective. It's like, okay, what changed? The squads get the ability to make their decisions, and when they learn things, they don't have to crack on with it and say, but I committed to delivering this in the quarter. If they learn something, they kill it, or they change it, or they descope it, or they extend it, or defer it, or put it on the shelf if it's not important. So we go through that. We do a mid-cycle check-in, which is at the beginning of the cycle. We do a algorithmic. The product owners, the business stakeholders, and the engineers all put a confidence vote in terms of the ambition and our ability to execute on the quarter. We do that again at mid-quarter, and then we actually do a macro retrospective at the end of the cycle. And then over time, and this has been my experience, I'm not going to play the video, but everybody's seen Forrest Gump. You know, when he's like, Jenny is telling him, run, Forrest, run. They're throwing rocks at him, and those leg braces come flying off. So think of it, this capacity planning as Forrest Gump's leg braces. Eventually they go away, and you end up with this squad level organic natural curation and prioritization with less dependencies. And it works. It's kind of magical in that way. It's kind of a simple technique, but it works. So that's the overview, and I'll pause there and see what comes up.
Yeah, we got a couple questions, Jim. It's Grant. So from a level of fidelity perspective, ton of detail. Obviously, you're going to have a bunch of different stakeholders. What do you find is the right balance? Is there any diminishing returns?
You mean in terms of how much do we invest in the conversations, for example, or how much effort?
Well, if you're presenting this to the sort of head of sales or CRO, the level of granularity that they're going to be interested in is probably not this level of detail. Where do you find the sweet spot is?
Oh, I see. Well, for them, that happens at the OKR level, right, and the initiative level. So that's about as far as they go. They don't drill into, like, if I go look at one of the epics, they don't go look at the epics, right? They care about that we've curated the initiative. It matches their OKR. So our OKRs, I'll just show you an example of the OKRs. That this is where we align with the senior, business leaders, essentially. Stand by. Yeah, here. It's taking a bit to load. So it's at this level we have the conversations with our senior stakeholders mostly. And what we do, if we go into one, you'll see that we actually do. This is shared and ratified. There's an owner of each one of them, and then we make sure that we have an acceptance criteria that is, there's also job stories inside the actual epics. But at the OKR level, there's an acceptance criteria that says this is the outcome that we agree with the business is what we're seeking. And then we go and we implement the initiatives that support that OKR and the epics that support the initiatives, and that's how it goes. Does that answer the question? Ish?
I believe so, yeah.
You guys can talk out loud too. I don't think you're muted.
Yeah, if there's any questions, you can unmute and ask directly.
I guess my question would be: do people understand what it is we're looking to achieve in doing this? Yeah, no.
Hey, Jim. Question here related to that. I mean, do you see this working how do you see this working at a smaller company versus larger company, or for those that are much more founder driven versus ones that might be less so? Let's say, how does it evolve?
That's a good question. So in my experience, I mean, I haven't done it at a company of, say 4 squads. There's a more natural, organic, osmotic, if you will, osmosis. I don't know if that's a word, osmosis kind of opportunity when you're a company of, 50 to 100 people. It's when you get up above 150, we're at 300 people at Raisin. At Prezi, we were about the same. Even at Tesco, when I was at Tesco, we had our group was about that, on the 300 to 500 level. That seems to be, I haven't tried it at the 2,000 person company level, but in that growth stage company, it's worked very, very well for a company that's grown very, very fast, and you don't get that everybody's in the same room, everybody understands what's important, everybody can see everything, kind of dynamic. So it's that middle ground. So I would say it's probably most useful when you're above 6 to 9, maybe, squads.
Got it. And then just to follow up, you talked about project management. How do you link that into the product? Like, where does project fit within the engineering discipline, within the product discipline? Is it a cross-functional, is it a cross-shared area? I've seen,
Yes.
At least my personal experience, I've seen people, there's differences in where people are, who ownership and kind of managing it versus owning it and directing.
So my past, I mean, there's lots of ways to do it, as you know. My personal experience has been that program management is part of product. It's not part of engineering, and that those product folks, I train them like product people. So even though they're doing they don't own anything per se, or they own the process and they own the facilitation, they don't own the product, or they don't own a team. Our current program management team is a cross section of business people, data people, and product people. And we actually have dedicated, we didn't a year ago, and now we do have dedicated program managers, because we've shown the efficacy is so high, right? The ROI has been extraordinary. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, I mean, what I heard you say was it's under product versus engineering.
Hey guys, we're at time. Is it okay if we just take questions offline? I just want to make sure that that we're cognizant of the time right now. So thanks guys, really appreciate it. Shantanu, I'll connect you with Jim if you have any additional questions, but I really appreciate it. If you guys don't mind filling out the survey that I put into the chat, that'd be awesome. We'd love to hear about what future topics you want to hear about and whether you felt this was useful or not. And I'll be following up with a link to a sanitized version of that workbook. So thanks to everyone. And
I'll be sending the Miro board, sanitized version of the Miro. Well, I'll send this Miro board and this workshop master, so you can peruse it at your will.
Perfect. Okay. Thanks everyone.
All right. Cheers, guys.